Welcome again to the 21st Century Reformation Hour. The big news this week, of course, in the world has been the death of Margaret Thatcher. So we have our lead story this week, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, closer to the Bible than liberal churchmen. The liberal churchmen in England, they opposed her. Only 15% would vote for her. So I point out that she gave a speech to some Scottish Presbyterian group some years ago, and I printed that speech here, and also the speech she gave when Ronald Reagan died. And that led me also to put in our paper this week what we had when President Reagan died, a redeemed sinner and saint. There you have the front page of or the cover of our church sign, Ronald Reagan, a redeemed sinner and saint. And that's where Margaret Thatcher spoke. And what really was the redeeming feature of that service when Reagan died was the liturgy. I said the liturgy, in a sense, helped save the day, as it often does at funerals, where one eulogy follows another. The sinner who trusts only in Jesus Christ and not his own works for eternal salvation is one of God's saints in heaven, not because of what he has done, but because only what Jesus has done for him. And that came through in the liturgy. Usually when these dignitaries died, you have a long list of speeches, how great the person was. The funeral of Margaret Thatcher hasn't taken place yet. As I'm speaking to you here, I don't know what's going to happen there. But anyway, she made a pretty good statement there when Reagan died. And then I also have here two classy ladies. Who are the two classy ladies? Well, first of all, Margaret Thatcher. I mentioned how she prepared that speech. She was beginning to lose her speech at that time already, and so she had it all recorded ahead of time. She was prepared, and she was the only big figure in the world that flew with the Reagan family from there all the way across the country to be there at the funeral, at the cemetery when they buried him. And then Nancy Reagan. Why was she classy? Well, at that funeral, President Clinton wanted to say a few words. You know, we don't want to make this political, only Republicans. No. And you have the reasons why, because how he desecrated the White House office. And Reagan thought, he said he never would have done that. All the other stories here. I have a new book here on Victory Rests with the Lord on Vietnam, written by one of the soldiers over there. And then what that led me to do was to go back, what did we all say about the war in Vietnam, and also war itself. Now, as I've said repeatedly, we're not pacifists here at Christian News, but we don't think we ought to be meddling all over the world. And so in that sense, we follow what George Washington said in his farewell address. Have a mighty defense, we're not pacifists, but don't get mixed up in wars all over the world. Then I have here in this issue, you might say this is our funeral issue. We have here Dr. Francis Monseth. I met this gentleman in Geneva, Switzerland in 1965 at the conference of the International Council of Christian Churches. Now they have people, they say, from about 100 different countries there. They also had a meeting of International Christian Youth. He was with the International Christian Youth at that time. He ended up many, many years teaching at the Association of Free Lutheran Churches Seminary. He probably was their leading theologian. He was a young man at the time. I have pictures in here showing how we were together at the time. But then I also watched his funeral, and I comment on that funeral. Then also here, I have a statement by Dr. Walter Meyer. You know, when a national figure died, like Roosevelt, Meyer would comment on that. Obviously can't comment now, he'd been dead since 1950. But we have a statement from his book, how Meyer would stand up and speak firmly, defending the fundamentals of the Christian faith. And we have some of his speeches in our book, Walter Meyer Still Speaks, Missouri and the World Should Listen. What do I have in the book there? That book, it's available in Christian News. It was things that Dr. Meyer's wife gave me more than 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when I was a student in the seminary, and included the funeral addresses there. And that's in the book. Also what Dr. John W. Bankin preached at the end of the next yes, the next Sunday in the Lutheran hour, his sermon then at that time. Then I have here a 50-year team. What does that mean? Well, that's the organist we have. You know, there are organists have been there 50 years, pastors 50 years, but seldom, I don't think, there have been too many where the organist and the preacher. My case will be 55 years. And I have here at the end the kind of a funeral that this organist wants. And basically that really is the kind of a funeral that I've had through the years here. She mentions that, oh yes, here, used as the text, by grace are ye saved through faith. It is a gift of God, not of works, let any man should boast. She lists the funeral dresses there, and nothing bragging about the record. Only trusting Jesus as the only Savior from sin. And so that really is basically in this issue where we talk about the funeral of these prominent people. I have here another funeral of a lady. She had 40 she had 11 children, more than 40 grandchildren. A wonderful funeral also, sermon delivered at her funeral. And her pastor that delivered it has a PhD in science. And he talks about the resurrection of the body. Does that body really rise from the dead? Well, let's always remember then as we watch funerals, we want to hear about Jesus. So that's why I have here, beginning, Christ-centered funerals. God be with you. We will see you next week.